Connick, before sentencing, do you have anything to say?
He betrayed us. I did exactly what needed to be done, what my mother was too weak to do herself. And honestly, I would do it again.
Your lack of remorse is disturbing. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison.
The Aspen County Courthouse stood silent on that frigid January morning, snow drifting lazily past its imposing windows as Judge Eleanor Harmon prepared to deliver a verdict that would shake the affluent Colorado mountain community to its core. Inside courtroom 3A, the gallery benches were packed shoulder to shoulder with stunned locals, national media, and the morbidly curious, all eyes fixed on the slight figure of 15-year-old Angela Connick, standing eerily motionless at the defense table in her navy blue dress and white cardigan, blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail that made her look even younger than her 15 years. Behind the prosecution table, encased in clear evidence plastic and positioned where everyone could see it, sat Exhibit A shattered 19th-century Austrian snow globe, its once pristine glass dome now jagged and broken, dried blood still visible in the crevices despite the forensic cleaning, the murder weapon that Angela had used to bludgeon her father to death on Christmas morning. Judge Harmon's gavel cracked through the hushed courtroom like a gunshot, silencing the few whispers that had dared to break the tension as she prepared to announce whether this teenager would spend the rest of her life behind bars for one of the most shocking crimes in Aspen's history. If you're watching this, hit the subscribe button and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We're always fascinated to learn how far these true crime stories reach. Now, let's continue with the case that shocked the wealthy ski town of Aspen and made national headlines when a teenage girl from a seemingly perfect family committed an unthinkable act on what should have been the most joyful day of the year. "All rise," commanded the bailiff, his voice echoing against the wood-paneled walls as Judge Harmon adjusted her black robes and fixed her steely gaze on the young defendant. Defense attorney Martin Sutherland placed a supportive hand on Angela's shoulder, but she shrugged it off without changing her expression, her blue eyes remaining as cold and distant as the snow-capped mountains visible through the courtroom windows. Across the aisle, prosecutor Claire Anderson straightened her burgundy blazer and exchanged a brief glance with Detective Robert Miller, the lead investigator who had spent Christmas Day and the following weeks piecing together the horrific events at the luxury Airbnb instead of celebrating with his own family. Judge Harmon cleared her throat, the sound amplified by the courtroom microphone as she addressed Angela directly. "Ms. Connick, you stand before this court having been found guilty of murder in the first degree. A crime made all the more heinous by the fact that the victim was your own father, and that you chose to end his life on Christmas Day in a premeditated act of violence that has shocked this community." The judge paused, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied Angela's impassive face, searching for any sign of remorse or emotion in the teenager who had maintained the same unnervingly blank expression throughout the entire 3-week trial. "Before I pronounce sentence, I must ask if you have anything you wish to say to this court, to the family members present, or to the memory of your father, James Connick." A collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom as Angela slowly stepped forward, her handcuffs clinking softly in the silence, and raised her eyes to meet the judge's gaze with a directness that made several jurors shift uncomfortably in their seats. "He betrayed us," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, lacking any tremor of emotion or hint of the tears one might expect from a teenage girl facing a life sentence. "I did what needed to be done, what my mother was too weak to do herself, and I would do it again," she continued, turning slightly to look at the prosecution table where her mother, Carissa Connick, sat with her shoulders hunched and her face hidden in her hands, her body shaking with silent sobs. The gallery erupted into shocked murmurs as Judge Harmon's gavel came down hard, once, twice, 3 times, until order was restored and Angela returned to her previous stance, arms at her sides, expression neutral as though she had merely commented on the weather, rather than shown zero remorse for killing her own father. Ms. Connick, your lack of remorse and your continued insistence on justifying this brutal murder are deeply troubling to this court, Judge Harmon stated, her voice growing firmer as she prepared to deliver the sentence. The evidence presented in this trial has made clear that your actions were not only violent but calculated. Researching methods of patricide in advance, selecting a valuable family heirloom as your weapon, and attempting to create a false narrative of self-defense that forensic evidence has thoroughly disproved. Claire Anderson stood at the prosecution table, arranging the photos that had been so crucial to securing the guilty verdict. The blood spatter analysis showing Angela had been the aggressor, the close-up of James Connick's defensive wounds, the reconstructed fingerprint on the snow globe that matched Angela's grip pattern, and most damning of all, the library records showing Angela had checked out 3 books on famous parricide cases just weeks before the murder. Your Honor, the state of Colorado recommends the maximum sentence allowable under juvenile offender statutes: life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after serving a minimum of 25 years, Anderson stated, her voice steady but tinged with the emotion that Angela's lacked. While we acknowledge the defendant's age as a mitigating factor that spares her from life without parole, we must emphasize that the premeditation, brutality, and complete lack of remorse demonstrated by Angela Connick make her a continuing danger to society, particularly to her own mother, whom she has repeatedly blamed for her actions. Defense attorney Sutherland rose quickly, his normally commanding courtroom presence diminished by the weight of the case and his client's damaging statement. Your Honor, despite my client's comments today, I must urge the court to consider that Angela is still a child, a 15-year-old whose brain is not fully developed, who acted out of a misguided belief that her family was being destroyed by her father's actions. He glanced nervously at Angela, who stared straight ahead as if bored by the proceedings that would determine her fate for the next 2.5 decades. The defense asks the court to consider the minimum sentence of 15 years with possibility of parole, with mandatory psychological treatment throughout her incarceration, giving this young woman the chance to grow, to understand the gravity of her actions, and to potentially rehabilitate and re-enter society as a productive citizen. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as Judge Harmon considered both arguments, the only sound the soft clicking of a news photographer's camera from the designated media area at the back of the room. After careful consideration of all evidence presented during this trial, the particularly heinous nature of this crime, and the defendant's continued lack of remorse, this court has no choice but to impose the sentence recommended by the prosecution, Judge Harmon finally declared, her voice echoing with finality through the stunned courtroom. Angela Connick, I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after serving a minimum of 25 years in the Colorado Department of Corrections Juvenile Division until you reach the age of 18, at which time you will be transferred to adult facilities to serve the remainder of your sentence. A single anguished sob escaped from Carissa Connick as the sentence was pronounced, her body seeming to collapse further into itself as the reality set in that she had now lost not only her husband but her daughter as well, both taken from her on the same Christmas morning. Behind her, James Connick's half-sister Mara, whose appearance at the family's Christmas celebration had inadvertently triggered the tragic events, placed a comforting hand on Carissa's shoulder, her own face streaked with tears as she whispered something that seemed to bring Carissa no comfort. The courtroom remained largely silent, without the usual murmurs or reactions that typically follow a sentencing, as if the collective horror of what this teenage girl had done, and her continued justification of it, had rendered everyone momentarily speechless. Angela's expression didn't change as the bailiffs moved forward to take her into custody, securing her handcuffs and preparing to lead her from the courtroom to begin her quarter century of incarceration. Only when she turned to follow them did the mask slip for the briefest moment, as her eyes met those of her mother across the courtroom. A flicker of something unidentifiable passed across her face before the cold, emotionless facade returned. "This case is adjourned," Judge Harmon announced, her final strike of the gavel punctuating the end of one of the most disturbing trials in Aspen's history, as Angela Connick was led through the side door toward a prison transport vehicle, leaving behind a shattered family and a community struggling to comprehend how the privileged daughter of a respected local businessman could have committed such a calculated, brutal act on Christmas morning. The morning of December 25th, 2024, dawned crisp and brilliant over Aspen, Colorado, the sun glinting off fresh powder that had fallen overnight, creating the picture-perfect Christmas that wealthy visitors paid thousands to experience in the exclusive mountain town. Detective Robert Miller was just sitting down to Christmas breakfast with his wife and 2 teenage daughters when his phone vibrated with the call that would consume the next several months of his life and shake the foundations of Aspen's tight-knit community. The voice on the other end belonged to Dispatch Officer Tanya Wilson, her usually professional tone tinged with shock as she reported a potential homicide at 1847 Pinecrest Road, a luxury Airbnb property nestled in the secluded mountainside above the town's main resort area. Caller is Carissa Connick, reporting her husband is dead and that her 15-year-old daughter is responsible, Wilson said, the information so jarring that Miller initially thought he'd misheard, especially when she added the detail that would later seem darkly symbolic. The alleged murder weapon is a snow globe. Miller's unmarked SUV crunched through the fresh snow of the winding mountain road leading to the Airbnb, Christmas music still playing softly on the radio, creating a surreal contrast to the crime scene he was about to face. The property came into view, a modern 6-bedroom mountain lodge with floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the snow-covered pines surrounding it. The kind of vacation rental that typically housed celebrities and tech billionaires looking for privacy during the holiday ski season. 2 patrol cars had already arrived, their lights painting silent red and blue patterns across the pristine white landscape, while a young officer stood at the door speaking into his radio, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Officer Jenkins briefed Miller as they approached the house. Female victim called 911 at 8:47 a.m., initially reporting an accident, then changed her statement during the call to say her daughter had killed her husband with an antique snow globe during an argument. Inside, the contrast between Christmas celebration and violent crime scene couldn't have been more stark. A massive decorated tree towered in the great room, presents still wrapped beneath it, while nearby, the body of James Connick, a 46-year-old investment manager from Chicago, lay sprawled on the hardwood floor, surrounded by shards of glass and a spreading pool of blood that had begun to congeal. The smell of pine needles and cinnamon from holiday decorations mingled with the metallic scent of blood, creating a nauseating combination that Miller would later say haunted him for months after the case was closed. What struck Miller immediately, more than the gruesome scene itself, was the behavior of the 2 remaining Connick family members. Carissa Connick, 44, sat rigid on a leather sofa, staring blankly at the fireplace where stockings hung with the family's names embroidered in gold thread, while her daughter Angela sat in a nearby armchair, legs crossed, seemingly calm as she scrolled through her phone. "She's been like that since we arrived," Officer Jenkins whispered to Miller, nodding toward the teenager who hadn't even looked up when they entered the room. "Hasn't asked about her dad once, hasn't cried, just keeps muttering something about his girlfriend and how he deserved it. It's the creepiest thing I've ever seen, especially from a kid." Miller approached Angela first, noting her pristine appearance, not a hair out of place in her blonde ponytail, wearing what looked like brand-new Christmas pajamas, with no visible blood on her despite the violent scene just feet away. "Angela, I'm Detective Miller," he began, crouching to eye level with the seated girl, using the gentle tone he'd developed over years of interviewing traumatized witnesses and victims. The girl looked up from her phone with an expression that sent a chill through Miller's experienced frame. Her blue eyes were completely devoid of emotion, as if she were merely annoyed at being interrupted while texting a friend. "I need to ask you some questions about what happened here this morning," Miller continued, fighting to maintain his professional demeanor as Angela's lips curved into what could almost be described as a smile. "He was cheating on my mom," Angela stated matter-of-factly, her voice steady and clear, lacking any of the shock or distress that would be expected after witnessing, let alone causing, a violent death. Miller noted this immediate introduction of motive without being prompted, a red flag he'd seen before in cases where perpetrators had rehearsed their stories. "I found the messages on his phone 3 weeks ago. He's been seeing someone named Mara, sneaking around behind our backs, lying to us every day while pretending to be the perfect husband and father," she continued, her voice taking on a theatrical quality that seemed practiced rather than emotional. Angela's unprompted narrative continued as the forensic team arrived and began processing the bloody scene just yards away. "Last night I saw him outside hugging her in the driveway on Christmas Eve while Mom was inside making hot chocolate for us." Her tone remained unnervingly even as she described discovering what she believed was her father's infidelity, not once looking at her father's body or acknowledging the gravity of his death. "This morning we were arguing about it. I confronted him, told him I knew everything, and he came at me. So I grabbed the snow globe from the display case and hit him," she concluded, the rehearsed quality of her statement becoming even more apparent as she repeated the same phrases, with the same inflections, when Miller asked her to clarify certain points. Meanwhile, the forensics team, led by Dr. Samantha Reeves, was already noting inconsistencies in Angela's account as they examined the crime scene. "Detective, the blood spatter pattern doesn't match a self-defense scenario," Reeves said quietly, pulling Miller aside while an officer stayed with Angela. "Based on the distribution on the floor and nearby furniture, the victim was struck from behind first, then repeatedly as he fell forward, not consistent with someone defending themselves from an approaching threat." The detail that stood out most to Reeves was the murder weapon itself, a valuable 19th-century Austrian snow globe that had been displayed in a locked case in the Airbnb study, meaning Angela would have had to find the key or break the case to access it, suggesting a level of premeditation that contradicted her claim of spontaneously grabbing it during an argument. Carissa Connick's initial statement to the second detective on scene painted a very different picture from her daughter's calm recounting. "I was upstairs when I heard the arguing, then this horrible sound, like something heavy hitting flesh. Over and over," she sobbed, her entire body shaking as shock set in. "By the time I got downstairs, James was on the floor and Angela was just standing there, holding that snow globe, covered in his blood and looking pleased with herself." The most disturbing detail from Carissa's statement came when she admitted she hadn't immediately called 911, explaining through tears that she'd found Angela washing the snow globe in the bathroom sink, attempting to clean off fingerprints, and had hidden it in her own suitcase before finally making the call. A 90-minute delay that would later complicate the prosecution's case and nearly result in charges against Carissa herself. As the Christmas morning sun climbed higher over the Aspen Mountains, casting long shadows through the lodge's windows, Miller made the difficult decision to place Angela Connick under arrest for the murder of her father. "You have the right to remain silent," he began, watching carefully for any reaction as he recited the Miranda rights to the teenager who had just committed patricide on Christmas morning. Angela's response chilled everyone in the room. She simply held out her wrists for the handcuffs, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth as she said, "I know my rights, Detective Miller," before adding in a voice just loud enough for her mother to hear. "He got what he deserved, and she knows it." The evidence collection continued throughout Christmas Day, with Miller's team documenting every aspect of the scene while holiday music still played softly from the home sound system, a macabre soundtrack to their grim work. The snow globe fragments were carefully collected, with particular attention paid to the largest remaining piece of the base, which appeared to have been the primary impact point against James Connick's skull. "We'll need to rush the fingerprint analysis on this," Miller instructed, watching as the evidence technician carefully bagged the blood-smeared piece of what had once been a beautiful holiday decoration, now transformed into a murder weapon in one of the most disturbing cases of his 20-year career. Outside, neighbors from the adjacent luxury properties had gathered at the police perimeter, their Christmas celebrations interrupted by the procession of emergency vehicles and the shocking news spreading through text messages and phone calls across Aspen's elite circles. The Connicks seemed so normal when they checked in 3 days ago, the property manager told Miller as Angela was led to a police vehicle, the teenager walking with her head held high, despite the handcuffs. James tipped the staff generously, asked for extra firewood, said they were having a special family Christmas with a surprise guest joining them on Christmas morning. This casual mention of a surprise guest immediately caught Miller's attention, prompting him to ask for details about this person who might prove crucial to understanding what had really happened in the hours leading up to James Connick's death. The Aspen Police Department's interview room offered a stark contrast to the luxury mountain lodge where the Connicks had planned to spend their Christmas holiday. Bare walls painted institutional beige, a metal table bolted to the floor, and chairs designed for functionality rather than comfort. Detective Miller sat across from Angela Connick, who had changed from her Christmas pajamas into department-issued clothes, the orange fabric making her appear even younger and more vulnerable than her 15 years. Yet the vulnerability of her appearance was completely contradicted by her demeanor. She sat with perfect posture, hands folded neatly on the table, responding to questions with the measured precision of someone much older, occasionally even correcting Miller's chronology of events with an unsettling attention to detail that experienced detectives typically associate with careful planning rather than traumatic recall. "Let's go back to the messages you found on your father's phone," Miller suggested, pushing a notepad across the table and watching Angela's face for any emotional reaction. "Can you write down exactly what you saw, the dates, the specific wording that made you believe he was having an affair?" Angela took the pen without hesitation, her handwriting neat and controlled as she listed dates, times, and fragments of text messages between her father and someone named Mara, including phrases like, "Can't wait to see you," "Need to keep this between us for now," and "Carissa can't know until I'm ready to tell her." What stood out to Miller wasn't just the content she claimed to have seen, but the methodical way she had apparently documented it. Not the impulsive reaction of a hurt teenager, but the calculated evidence gathering of someone building a case. In the adjacent observation room, Detective Sarah Cooper watched the interview alongside Dr. Eliza Vernon, a forensic psychologist frequently consulted by the Aspen PD on cases involving juvenile offenders. Notice her affect, completely flat, no emotional modulation when discussing her father's death or her mother's distress, Dr. Vernon noted, making her own observations as Angela continued her eerily composed recounting of the events. Most teenagers, even those with conduct disorders, show some emotional dysregulation after a traumatic event, particularly one they caused: anger, defiance, tearfulness, something. But she's displaying what we call affective dissonance, where her emotional presentation is completely incongruent with the situation. Meanwhile, in another interview room, Detective Lisa Harmon was having a very different conversation with Carissa Connick, who alternated between sobbing uncontrollably and staring blankly into space, the classic signs of acute traumatic shock. "I should have seen it coming," Carissa whispered, clutching a paper cup of untouched coffee as if it were a lifeline. Angela's behavior has been changing for months, more secretive, staying in her room, getting angry over tiny things. But I thought it was just normal teenage stuff, maybe stress from school. The most disturbing revelation came when Carissa admitted that Angela had begun asking strange questions about her father's schedule, his passwords, whether their home insurance covered violent death, questions that had seemed odd but not alarming at the time, but now formed a chilling pattern of premeditation. Back in the primary interview room, Miller shifted his approach, moving from open-ended questions to more direct challenges of Angela's self-defense narrative. Angela, the forensic team found something interesting about the snow globe you used. He slid a preliminary report across the table, watching her eyes scan the document with an intelligence that belied her age. The glass case it was kept in was locked, and according to the property manager, the key was hidden in a desk drawer in the study. Can you explain how you accessed it during what you describe as a sudden, heated argument? For the first time since her arrest, Angela's composure flickered momentarily, a tightening around her eyes, a slight stiffening of her shoulders, before she offered a response that contradicted her earlier statement. The case wasn't locked when I checked it yesterday. Someone must have left it open. The investigation accelerated as forensic results began coming in throughout that Christmas night and into the following day, each piece of evidence further undermining Angela's version of events. Blood spatter analysis by Dr. Reeves confirmed what she had initially observed at the scene. The patterns were consistent with an attack from behind, with James Connick being struck first while facing away from his assailant, then repeatedly as he fell and attempted to turn toward his attacker. Based on the spatter height and distribution, the attacker was standing approximately 18 inches away, not engaged in a close-range struggle, as would be expected in self-defense, Reeves explained to Miller as they reviewed the preliminary report. Most telling is the void pattern on the hardwood floor, which indicates the victim was struck at least 3 times after he had already fallen when he would have posed no threat to anyone. Perhaps the most damning forensic discovery came from the fragments of the snow globe itself, which had been rush processed in the lab due to the high-profile nature of the case. We found 2 distinct fingerprint patterns on the remaining pieces, the technician reported, placing enhanced images on Miller's desk. The first set belongs to the victim, James Connick, but they're in a defensive position, consistent with him trying to push the object away from his face during the attack. The second set of prints told the real story of what had happened in that mountain lodge on Christmas morning. These belong to Angela Connick, and they're in what we call a power grip position. Fingers wrapped around the base of the snow globe, thumb positioned for a forward thrust. Exactly the grip pattern you'd see in someone using an object as a weapon, not defending themselves. While the physical evidence mounted against Angela's self-defense claim, digital forensics specialist Trevor Wong made a discovery that would further establish premeditation. I've been analyzing the family's devices, and Angela's search history is concerning, Wong told Miller, sliding over a printed log of browser activity. In the 3 weeks before Christmas, she searched for phrases including, "How hard to hit someone in the head to kill them? Can you clean fingerprints off glass?" And most specifically, famous cases where children killed their parents. The digital trail continued with Angela's visits to true crime websites focusing on patricide cases, particularly those involving teenagers who had killed parents they believed had betrayed the family, searches that directly contradicted her claim of acting in sudden self-defense during an unexpected argument. The most unexpected evidence came from James Connick's phone, which had been recovered from his pocket and unlocked using his fingerprint at the morgue, a standard but macabre practice in digital evidence collection. I found the messages Angela referenced, but they don't indicate what she claims, Wong explained, showing Miller the exchanges between James and someone named Mara Connick. Based on the full conversation thread, Mara appears to be James's half-sister, not a romantic interest, They share the same father, but were raised separately, and it seems James was helping her escape from an abusive relationship. The messages revealed that James had been secretly meeting Mara to provide financial assistance and emotional support, keeping it from his family temporarily because Mara's situation involved a potentially dangerous ex-partner who was still looking for her. As Christmas Day gave way to December 26th, the investigation took another turn when a call came in from the security office of Aspen Community Library. "We've got something that might be relevant to your murder case," the head librarian told Miller, her voice tight with concern. One of our staff recognized Angela Connick's name from the news and remembered her checking out several unusual books recently. The library records, quickly subpoenaed and delivered to the department, showed that Angela had checked out 3 books in early December: Parricide, Children Who Kill Their Parents, Famous Family Murders, and The Psychology of Patricide. Academic texts that were clearly research materials for someone planning, not spontaneously committing, a violent crime against their parent. By the evening of December 26th, Detective Miller had assembled enough evidence to formally charge Angela Connick with first-degree murder, upgrading the initial homicide charge to reflect the clear premeditation established by both physical and digital evidence. "Angela Connick, based on the evidence collected, you are being charged with murder in the first degree," Miller informed her during a formal charging interview with her court-appointed attorney, now present. "The state of Colorado will be seeking to try you as an adult due to the premeditated nature of the crime and the extensive evidence of planning." Throughout this procedure, Angela maintained the same unnervingly calm demeanor, her only visible reaction being a slight narrowing of her eyes when Miller mentioned the library books, the first indication that she recognized her planning might not have been as careful as she believed. The Pitkin County Courthouse buzzed with tension on the trial's opening day as Prosecutor Claire Anderson arranged her evidence meticulously at the government's table, placing the reconstructed snow globe fragments in clear view of the jury box. "Members of the jury," Anderson began, her voice confident yet somber as she addressed the 12 citizens tasked with determining the fate of the teenage girl seated at the defense table. "What you will see over the coming days is evidence of a crime that defies our understanding of family, of childhood, and of the sanctity of Christmas Day itself." Behind her, a large screen displayed a photograph of the Connick family taken just months before the murder. James and Carissa Connick smiling broadly, their arms around Angela, who even then seemed oddly detached, her smile not quite reaching her eyes in a detail that now seemed darkly prophetic to everyone in the courtroom. "The murder weapon in this case tells its own story," Anderson continued, lifting the evidence bag containing the largest remaining piece of the snow globe, its heavy glass base now permanently stained with James Connick's blood despite forensic cleaning. This was no ordinary decoration, but a valuable antique Austrian snow globe from the 19th century, part of the property owner's private collection, kept locked in a display case in the study of the Airbnb where the Connick family was spending their Christmas holiday. The prosecutor walked slowly before the jury box, making sure each juror could clearly see the jagged edges of the once beautiful object that had been transformed into an instrument of death in the hands of a 15-year-old girl. The evidence will show that Angela Connick didn't grab this in a moment of panic or self-defense, as she claims. She had to find the hidden key, unlock the display case, and remove this specific item, all before the alleged confrontation with her father even began. Dr. Samantha Reeves took the stand as the prosecution's first expert witness, her credentials in forensic science and blood pattern analysis establishing her as one of the top experts in her field before she began explaining the damning physical evidence against Angela. Based on the blood spatter patterns found at the scene, we can reconstruct precisely how this attack occurred, Dr. Reeves explained, using laser pointers on projected crime scene photographs to illustrate her analysis. The initial impact occurred while the victim was facing away from his attacker, with blood evidence indicating he was struck from behind with significant force, causing immediate disorientation. The courtroom grew silent as Reeves detailed the subsequent blows, each one delivered with what she described as consistent force and precision, suggesting not frenzied self-defense, but deliberate, controlled violence. The most compelling testimony from Dr. Reeves came when she explained how the blood spatter contradicted Angela's claim of self-defense. If the defendant had been defending herself from an approaching threat, as she claims, we would expect to see forward projection patterns consistent with someone swinging outward to create distance. Using digital reconstruction on the courtroom screen, Reeves showed animations of what the blood patterns would have looked like in a genuine self-defense scenario versus what was actually found at the scene. Instead, what we observed were impact patterns consistent with someone standing in a stable position, delivering targeted downward and forward blows to a victim who was already falling or on the ground, completely inconsistent with self-defense and entirely consistent with an intentional attack. Following Dr. Reeves's testimony, fingerprint expert Marcus Hill took the stand to explain the damning hand position evidence found on the murder weapon. When someone grips an object to use as a weapon, they create distinct pressure patterns that differ significantly from defensive handling, Hill explained, using enlarged photographs to show the jury Angela's fingerprints on the remaining snow globe base. The defendant's prints show what we call a forward thrust grip pattern. Fingers wrapped securely around the base with the thumb positioned to direct force forward, exactly how someone would hold an object they intended to use as a weapon. Hill contrasted this with James Connick's partial fingerprints found on the same object. The victim's prints show a completely different pattern, fingers splayed in what we call a defensive push position, consistent with someone trying to block or push away an object being used to attack them. As the prosecution built its physical evidence case, digital forensics specialist Trevor Wong took the stand to present what many legal observers would later describe as the most devastating evidence against Angela. I analyzed the defendant's internet search history in the 3 weeks leading up to Christmas, Wong testified, scrolling through a chronological log displayed on the courtroom screen. On December 5th, the defendant searched "How to kill someone and make it look like an accident," followed by "Do children go to adult prison for murder?" and "How to clean fingerprints from glass objects." The jury visibly reacted as Wong continued through the increasingly specific searches that culminated in queries about famous patricide cases and the legal defenses that had failed or succeeded in those instances. Defense attorney Martin Sutherland fought to exclude the library evidence, arguing before Judge Harmon that it constituted prejudicial character evidence rather than direct evidence of the crime itself. Your Honor, my client's reading habits, particularly her interest in true crime, a genre popular among millions of Americans, should not be used to imply criminal intent, Sutherland argued during a hearing without the jury present. Judge Harmon's ruling sent a visible wave of defeat through the defense table. The court finds that the defendant's specific selection of books focused exclusively on children killing parents, checked out in the immediate weeks before committing that exact act, constitutes relevant evidence of premeditation and planning rather than general interest in the genre, and is therefore admissible. When forensic chemist Dr. Patricia Lynn took the stand, she presented evidence that would further dismantle Angela's self-defense claim, the analysis of the snow globe's unique mineral oil contents. Each antique snow globe contains a specific formula of mineral oil and preservative compounds that acts like a fingerprint for that particular item, Dr. Lynn explained to the captivated jury. We found traces of this specific mineral oil formula soaked into the right sleeve of Angela Connick's Christmas pajamas, concentrated in a pattern consistent with repeated forward thrusting motions, not defensive blocking. This evidence directly contradicted Angela's claim that she had only held the snow globe momentarily to defend herself, proving instead that she had used it repeatedly as an attack weapon, with enough force to cause the oil to splash and soak into her clothing. Perhaps the most visibly disturbing moment for the jury came when medical examiner Dr. Pai Howard Chang detailed James Connick's injuries through autopsy photographs and reports. The victim suffered a total of 7 distinct impact wounds from the snow globe, with the first strike to the back of the head causing a depressed skull fracture that would have immediately incapacitated him, Dr. Chang testified, using a laser pointer to indicate the wound patterns on anatomical diagrams, rather than showing the more graphic autopsy photos in deference to the victim's family present in the courtroom. The subsequent 6 blows were delivered after he had fallen, with 3 of them occurring when the victim was already face down on the floor and completely defenseless, showing a level of force that went well beyond any conceivable self-defense scenario. Dr. Prefui Chang's most critical testimony came when he discussed the glass fragments found embedded in James Connick's wounds. We recovered numerous shards of the snow globe's glass dome from the victim's wounds, particularly from his hands and forearms, indicating he was attempting to protect himself from the blows. Using microscopic imagery, Chang showed how skin cells matching Angela's DNA profile were found trapped under her father's fingernails, along with tiny fragments of the same glass. This evidence tells us that James Connick was conscious enough during at least part of the attack to try to push his attacker away, catching both her skin and glass fragments under his nails in the process. Definitive proof of a struggle where he was attempting to defend himself from her. Not the other way around. The prosecution's case reached a pivotal moment when the reconstructed snow globe was entered as Exhibit A, carefully assembled by forensic experts to show both its original beauty and its transformation into a deadly weapon. This object tells the complete story of premeditation, Anderson told the jury, holding the sealed evidence container so all could see the jagged edges where the glass dome had shattered. A cherished holiday symbol, locked away for safekeeping, deliberately taken by the defendant before any confrontation occurred, and used with such force that it shattered against her own father's skull, leaving evidence that scientific analysis has now made irrefutable. As Angela watched impassively from the defense table, her mother Carissa quietly sobbed in the front row of the gallery. The broken snow globe representing not just the murder weapon, but the shattered remains of what had once been a family celebrating Christmas, together in an Aspen Mountain lodge. The courtroom fell into stunned silence as digital evidence specialist Trevor Wong pulled up Angela's library borrowing record on the large presentation screen, displaying 3 book titles that sent whispers through the gallery: Parricide, Children Who Kill Their Parents, Famous Family Murders, and The Psychology of Patricide. Wong detailed the timeline with clinical precision. Angela Connick checked out these 3 books on December 4, 2024, exactly 3 weeks before the murder of her father on Christmas Day. The timestamp on the library's digital system showed the books had been checked out at 3:42 p.m., just 15 minutes after Aspen High School's dismissal time, indicating Angela had gone directly to the library for these specific materials. The library's security camera footage confirms it was indeed the defendant who checked out these books, and their due date was December 25th, Christmas Day, the very day she used the knowledge potentially gained from these texts to kill her father. Prosecutor Claire Anderson approached the evidence table where the 3 books lay in clear plastic evidence bags, lifting each one to show the jury before placing a selection of photocopied pages on the projector. The state would like to direct the jury's attention to these specific passages that were marked in pencil in the books when they were recovered from Angela Connick's bedroom, Anderson stated, highlighting sections about methods of patricide, psychological defenses used in famous cases, and most damning of all, a chapter discussing how teenage killers had attempted to use self-defense claims to justify their actions against parents. Detective Miller, watching from his seat behind the prosecution table, noted how several jurors visibly recoiled when Anderson revealed that the library's electronic records showed Angela had renewed these books twice, keeping them for the entire 3-week period leading up to the murder. Defense attorney Sutherland objected vigorously, rising to his feet with visible frustration. "Your Honor, this is pure prejudicial speculation. We cannot know what my client's academic interest in these topics might have been. And reading about crime does not prove intent to commit crime." Judge Harmon overruled the objection with a firm tap of her gavel. The specific nature of these texts, combined with their timing and the defendant's efforts to highlight certain passages, makes them relevant to establishing state of mind and premeditation. The objection is overruled. Angela's expression remained unchanged throughout this exchange, though observers noted her hands tightened slightly around the pencil she had been using to take notes, the only visible indication that the evidence had affected her at all. The prosecution's digital forensics presentation continued as Wong moved from library records to Angela's internet search history, which painted an even more disturbing picture of calculated planning. On December 5th, the day after checking out these books, the defendant's search history shows queries for how hard to hit someone in the head to kill them instantly, and can fingerprints be removed from glass objects. Wong testified, scrolling through screenshot after screenshot of searches that grew increasingly specific in the weeks leading up to Christmas. The searches progressed from general information about murder to specific queries about patricide cases, eventually focusing on details about snow globes, their weight, composition, and whether glass would shatter on impact with a human skull. Searches made just 5 days before the family's arrival at the Aspen Airbnb, where the murder would take place. Perhaps most disturbing to the jury was the revelation of a private document found on Angela's password-protected cloud storage, titled simply, "Christmas Plan." This document, created on December 10th, contains what appears to be a methodical outline for confronting James Connick about his alleged affair, with several scenarios sketched out, including one labeled "Last Resort" that included the phrases, "Use heavy object from display," and "Claim self-defense if necessary," Wong explained as the document was displayed on screen with key phrases highlighted. Defense attorney Sutherland's objections grew increasingly desperate as Wong revealed that the document had been modified multiple times, with the final edit occurring at 11:43 p.m. on Christmas Eve, just hours before James Connick's murder. The digital evidence trail led to Angela's school Chromebook, which had automatically backed up to the district's cloud storage system, capturing drafts of what appeared to be practice statements about self-defense. We recovered multiple versions of a document titled "What Happened," containing increasingly refined descriptions of a scenario where James Connick allegedly attacked Angela, forcing her to defend herself, Wong testified, showing the evolution of the narrative through 7 distinct drafts. The earliest version, dated December 12th, contained factual inconsistencies and awkward phrasing, while the final version, saved on December 23rd, presented the polished self-defense narrative that Angela had recited almost verbatim to Detective Miller on Christmas morning, compelling evidence that she had rehearsed her story well before the actual murder occurred. As the digital evidence mounted, Prosecutor Anderson called Aspen Public Library's head reference librarian, Eleanor Graves, to provide context for Angela's research methods. "In my 30 years as a librarian, I've assisted many students with research projects on criminal justice and psychology topics," Graves testified, her gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses giving her the quintessential librarian appearance that seemed to resonate with the jury. What struck me about Angela's approach was how methodical and specific her inquiries were. She wasn't browsing or exploring a topic broadly as students typically do. She was seeking very precise information about legal defenses in patricide cases, particularly those involving teenage perpetrators. Graves recounted helping Angela locate specific case studies of teenagers who had killed parents and successfully argued diminished capacity or temporary insanity, research that now appeared chillingly pragmatic in light of subsequent events. The court adjourned for lunch break following Graves's testimony, with legal commentators noting that Angela had maintained her unnervingly composed demeanor throughout the damning digital evidence presentation. Outside the courtroom, camera crews captured footage of Carissa Connick being escorted to a private waiting area, her face hidden behind large sunglasses despite the January gloom, while Angela was led back to juvenile detention by sheriff's deputies walking with the same eerily confident posture she had displayed since her arrest. Local news stations interrupted regular programming with updates on what the Aspen Daily had already dubbed the Christmas Snow Globe murder, with analysts discussing the unprecedented nature of the digital evidence trail left by a teenage killer who appeared to have researched, planned, and rehearsed her crime with disturbing thoroughness. When court resumed after lunch, the prosecution shifted focus to the physical evidence that corroborated the digital trail of premeditation, calling Airbnb property manager Bethany Winters to testify about the locked display case that had housed the murder weapon. The snow globe collection was specifically mentioned in our rental agreement as being locked and off-limits to guests, Winters explained, presenting the signed rental agreement with James Connick's signature acknowledging these terms. The key to the display case was kept in a hidden compartment of the antique desk in the study, which guests wouldn't know about unless they deliberately searched for it. This testimony directly contradicted Angela's claim that she had grabbed the snow globe spontaneously during an argument, as accessing it would have required finding the hidden key and unlocking the display case, actions that suggested planning rather than a heat-of-the-moment reaction. The final witness of the day was school guidance counselor Shannon Byers, whose testimony would prove crucial in establishing Angela's state of mind in the weeks before the murder. Angela scheduled 3 meetings with me in December, ostensibly to discuss college preparation, Byers stated, referring to notes from their sessions. However, the conversations repeatedly turned to hypothetical scenarios involving family betrayal and justified violence. Byers appeared visibly uncomfortable as she admitted that during their final meeting on December 18th, Angela had asked disturbing questions about whether teenagers could be tried as adults in Colorado and what constituted justifiable homicide. I documented concerns about these conversations in Angela's file, but did not report them to authorities or her parents, as I believed they fell under confidentiality guidelines for counseling sessions. Byers acknowledged, her voice tinged with regret as she glanced at Carissa Connick in the gallery, a decision that would later become the basis for Carissa's civil suit against the school district for failing to warn the family of Angela's concerning behavior. As the 5th day of trial concluded, Prosecutor Anderson stood before the jury for a brief summation of the digital evidence presented. What you've seen today is not the impulsive action of a teenager in emotional distress, but the calculated execution of a plan researched, refined, and rehearsed over weeks. A digital breadcrumb trail leading from library books to internet searches to practice statements, all culminating in the brutal murder of James Connick on Christmas morning. The jury filed out for the evening with solemn expressions, many avoiding looking at Angela as they passed the defense table, while Judge Harmon reminded them not to discuss the case or consume media coverage before the trial resumed the following morning with what would prove to be the most emotionally charged testimony yet: the appearance of the mysterious Mara, whose relationship with James Connick had been so catastrophically misinterpreted by his daughter. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted palpably on the morning Mara Connick was scheduled to testify. With extra security personnel positioned at the doors and the gallery packed beyond capacity, with journalists and spectators eager to finally put a face to the name that had featured so prominently in the case. Prosecutor Claire Anderson had strategically saved this witness for the midpoint of the trial, understanding the dramatic impact her testimony would have in dismantling Angela's claimed motive. "The state calls Mara Connick to the stand," Anderson announced, and a collective murmur swept through the courtroom as a slender woman with dark blonde hair and a striking resemblance to James Connick walked slowly to the witness stand, her hands visibly trembling as she placed them on the Bible to be sworn in. "Please state your name and relationship to the victim for the record," Judge Harmon instructed after the oath was administered, her voice gentle as she noted Mara's obvious distress. "Mara Elizabeth Connick. Was James Connick's half-sister," Mara replied, her voice barely audible until the court reporter asked her to speak up. Anderson approached the witness with a photograph that was then displayed on the courtroom screen. A decades-old image of a much younger James Connick standing beside a teenage Mara at what appeared to be a high school graduation. "Ms. Connick, could you please explain to the jury why, despite sharing the same last name and being related by blood, you were unknown to James's wife and daughter prior to the events of December 2024? Mara's testimony began with a family history that brought many in the courtroom to tears. "James and I share the same father, but we were raised separately after our parents divorced when I was 3 and James was 12. She explained that their father had taken James and started a new family in Chicago, while she remained with her mother in Portland, the siblings losing contact for nearly 2 decades until Mara found James through social media 7 years ago. We rebuilt our relationship slowly, meeting a few times a year. Usually when James had business trips to the West Coast, he wanted to integrate me into his family life eventually, but was waiting for the right time." Mara paused, her voice breaking as she added, "He was protective of me, especially after learning about my situation with Trevor, my ex-husband." The courtroom grew silent as Mara described the abusive relationship she had endured for 6 years with Trevor Blackwell, a relationship she had finally escaped in November 2024 after an incident that left her hospitalized with 3 broken ribs and a concussion. "James was my lifeline," she explained, dabbing at tears with a tissue provided by the court officer. "When I called him from the hospital, he immediately arranged for a safe apartment, paid the security deposit, and set up a new bank account for me that Trevor couldn't access." Anderson gently guided Mara through the timeline of events, establishing that the affair Angela believed she had discovered was actually James's effort to help his half-sister escape a life-threatening domestic violence situation while keeping the matter private to protect Mara from her still-searching ex-husband. "What was the nature of the messages Angela found on her father's phone?" Anderson asked, displaying several of the text exchanges that had been recovered from James's device. "James was helping me create a safety plan, arranging for security measures at my new apartment, and planning how to legally protect me from Trevor, who had violated restraining orders twice already," Mara explained, pointing to specific messages that, taken out of context, might have seemed romantic, but were actually discussions of safety protocols. When James wrote, "Can't wait to see you," he was referring to a meeting with a lawyer he'd arranged for me. "Need to keep this between us" was because Trevor had previously found me by questioning mutual friends and family members. Secrecy was literally keeping me alive. The most emotionally charged moment came when Anderson asked about Christmas Eve, the night Angela had seen Mara and James embracing in the driveway of the Airbnb. "James invited me to join the family for Christmas as a surprise, to finally introduce me to Carissa and Angela," Mara testified, her voice breaking. "He thought a holiday gathering in a secure location, a luxury Airbnb booked under a different name, would be the perfect opportunity for me to meet his family while staying safe from Trevor." Tears streamed down Mara's face as she described arriving late on Christmas Eve, being embraced by her brother in what would be their final moments together. "He hugged me and said, 'Tomorrow morning is going to be perfect. Carissa's always wanted you to be part of our family, and Angela will finally have the aunt she never knew existed." Anderson produced the Christmas gift that had been found in Mara's vehicle, still wrapped in festive paper with a tag reading, "To my niece Angela, so we can start making up for lost time." Inside was a custom photo album containing childhood pictures of James and Mara, along with a letter explaining their family connection and expressing hope for a relationship between aunt and niece. "James planned to give this to Angela after introducing us on Christmas morning," Mara explained, unable to look at the defendant as she spoke. "He was so excited about finally uniting his family. He had no idea that Angela had been reading his messages and completely misinterpreting everything." Defense attorney Sutherland's cross-examination attempted to challenge Mara's account, suggesting that her appearance at the family's Christmas gathering could reasonably have been misinterpreted by a teenage girl. "Ms. Connick, would you agree that without knowing your relationship to James, a 15-year-old girl might understandably be upset seeing her father embracing an unknown woman late at night?" Mara's response was measured but firm. "A 15-year-old might be confused or concerned, yes, but most teenagers would ask questions before jumping to conclusions, and certainly before committing murder." The gallery erupted in murmurs at this direct challenge, with Judge Harmon gaveling for order while Angela remained expressionless at the defense table, her eyes fixed on her notepad rather than on the aunt she had never officially met. During redirect, Anderson asked Mara about the morning of December 25th, what should have been her introduction to James's family. "I was staying at a hotel in downtown Aspen and was supposed to arrive for breakfast at 9 a.m., Mara explained, her voice hollow with grief. "I was running late because of a snow delay, and when I finally pulled into the driveway around 9:30, there were already police cars everywhere." The court fell silent as Mara described learning of her brother's death from officers at the scene, initially being treated as a potential suspect, until Carissa confirmed she had known about Mara's planned visit. "The worst part was realizing that if I had arrived on time, as planned, James might still be alive. I might have been there for the conversation that could have cleared up everything." Following Mara's testimony, Anderson called Carissa Connick back to the stand to corroborate key elements of the narrative. "James told me on December 23rd that he had a special surprise for Christmas morning, something that would make our family more complete," Carissa testified, her composure markedly different from her earlier appearances as she directed her testimony toward the jury rather than looking at her daughter. "He asked me to be sure we were all gathered in the great room at 9 a.m. on Christmas morning for what he called a family revelation before we opened presents." The timing was significant. James had been killed shortly before 8 a.m., approximately 1 hour before Mara was scheduled to arrive and reveal her identity to the family. The prosecution then presented phone records showing that James had made a brief call to Mara at 7:42 a.m. on Christmas morning, just minutes before the estimated time of his murder. "He called to confirm I was still coming at 9, said he could barely contain his excitement about introducing me to the family," Mara testified during her recall to the stand. "He told me Angela was already awake and helping Carissa with breakfast preparations. He had no idea she was actually planning to confront him about what she believed was an affair." Cell tower data confirmed Mara had been at her hotel during this call, placing her miles away from the crime scene at the time of James's death and definitively eliminating any possibility that she had been involved in the confrontation. As the day's testimony concluded, Anderson displayed side-by-side photographs of Mara and James on the courtroom screen, highlighting their similar features, particularly around the eyes and jawline, genetic markers of their shared paternity that Angela had seemingly failed to notice in her conviction that her father was having an affair. The truth that would have been revealed just 1 hour later on Christmas morning was that James Connick was not betraying his family but expanding it, attempting to heal a decades-old family separation and introduce his daughter to an aunt she never knew she had, Anderson stated in her closing remarks for the day, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. Instead, based on a tragic misinterpretation that she never bothered to verify, Angela Connick robbed her father of his life, her mother of her husband, and herself of an aunt who had been eagerly looking forward to being part of her life. As the court adjourned for the day, the impact of Mara's testimony was evident in the expressions of the jurors, many of whom glanced at Angela with what appeared to be a new understanding of the case as they filed out. Angela herself maintained the same composed demeanor she had displayed throughout the trial. Though observers noted she refused to look at either Mara or her mother as she was led from the courtroom, the teenager's cold detachment in the face of the emotional testimony appearing to reinforce the prosecution's portrayal of a calculated killer rather than a confused child who had made a tragic mistake. The seventh day of trial brought the most difficult testimony yet for Carissa Connick, who took the stand wearing a black dress and clutching a tissue that was already damp with tears before questioning even began. Prosecutor Anderson approached gently, understanding the delicate nature of what was about to be revealed. "Mrs. Connick, I need to ask you about the morning of December 25th, specifically the period immediately following your discovery of your husband's body." Carissa's hands trembled visibly as she nodded, her voice barely audible as she replied, "I know what you need me to explain." The courtroom fell completely silent, even the usual shuffling of papers and creaking of chairs suspended as jurors leaned forward slightly, sensing they were about to hear something crucial. "Please tell the court, in your own words, what happened after you came downstairs and found James on the floor," Anderson prompted, maintaining a respectful distance from the witness stand as Carissa gathered her strength. "I screamed when I saw him. There was so much blood, and the glass from the snow globe was everywhere," Carissa began, her voice strengthening as she forced herself to recount the traumatic memory. Angela was just standing there, still holding a piece of the snow globe's base, staring at him with this empty expression that terrified me. Carissa described her initial shock, checking desperately for signs of life from her husband, while Angela remained motionless, eventually dropping the glass fragment and walking calmly to the bathroom without saying a word. The most damning testimony came as Carissa described what happened next. "I followed her to the bathroom and found her washing the snow globe base under the faucet, carefully wiping it with a towel." Carissa paused, visibly struggling with her next words. "When I asked what she was doing, she looked at me with this cold, detached expression and said, 'I'm cleaning it so they won't know it was me. Dad was cheating on you with that woman, Mom. I did this for us.'" The gallery erupted in shocked murmurs at this revelation, with Judge Harmon quickly restoring order with her gavel as Carissa continued. "I was in complete shock, not processing what was happening. It felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from." Anderson guided Carissa through the critical 90-minute period that followed, the time frame that had initially puzzled investigators due to the delay between the estimated time of death and the 911 call. "I was in panic mode, not thinking clearly. I took the snow globe piece from Angela and hid it in my suitcase upstairs," Carissa admitted, tears flowing freely now. "I think some part of me was operating on maternal instinct, trying to protect my child, even though I knew what she'd done was monstrous." The courtroom remained absolutely silent as Carissa described wandering the house in shock, finding Angela in her bedroom calmly changing clothes and packing the bloody Christmas pajamas into a plastic bag, which she then asked her mother to dispose of. "Why didn't you call 911 immediately?" Anderson asked, the question that had been central to the investigation from the beginning. "I was in denial, completely dissociated from reality. I kept thinking if I just waited a little while, somehow this wouldn't be real," Carissa explained, her voice breaking. "I tried to talk to Angela, to understand why she'd done this, but she just kept repeating that James was having an affair and deserved what happened. The most disturbing detail emerged when Carissa described finding Angela's phone open to a notes app with what appeared to be a script. It had bullet points, things to say to the police, how to describe self-defense, even specific phrases like, "He came at me first," and "I feared for my life." It was like she was rehearsing lines for a performance. The critical turning point came when Carissa described her eventual decision to call 911. "I finally realized I couldn't undo what had happened, couldn't protect Angela from the consequences of what she'd done." Fighting through tears, Carissa recounted making the call while Angela sat on her bed, calmly instructing her mother on what to say. "She told me to say it was an accident, that James had attacked her. She was coaching me through the call like she'd planned for this exact scenario." This testimony directly contradicted Angela's initial statement to police that the 911 call had been made immediately after a spontaneous act of self-defense, a timeline now thoroughly disproven by her own mother's account. Forensic technician Alicia Ramirez took the stand next, explaining the remarkable process by which her team had recovered fingerprint evidence despite Carissa and Angela's attempts to clean the murder weapon. When the snow globe fragment was recovered from Mrs. Connick's suitcase, it had been wiped clean of visible fingerprints, Ramirez testified, using digital displays to show the evidence processing techniques. However, using alternative light sources and specialized chemical processes, we were able to reveal latent prints that remained microscopically embedded in the glass surface. Prints that matched Angela Connick's right hand in a grip pattern consistent with using the object as a weapon. Ramirez's testimony included a detailed explanation of the touch DNA recovered from the snow globe. Even thorough cleaning cannot remove all cellular material transferred during handling of an object, particularly one with the textured surface of the snow globe's decorative base. Using magnified images, Ramirez showed the jury where Angela's skin cells had been recovered from minute crevices in the ornate silver base of the snow globe, cells that contained her unique DNA profile and placed the murder weapon definitively in her hands. Most significantly, we found blood spatter from James Connick embedded in these same crevices, in a pattern that could only occur if the object was in Angela's hand during the attack, not afterward, as she claimed in her statement. The prosecution then called Special Agent Thomas Reed from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, who had been consulted on the case due to the unusual nature of a patricide committed by a teenage girl, a statistically rare crime that warranted specialized psychological analysis. What we observed in this case were classic hallmarks of premeditation, not just in the physical evidence, but in the behavioral evidence as well, Reed testified, noting Angela's calm demeanor immediately after the crime. The defendant's actions, cleaning the weapon, changing clothes, preparing a narrative, show what we call post-offense behavior management, which is typically seen in cases where the perpetrator has anticipated and planned for the aftermath of their crime. Agent Reed's analysis of Angela's digital footprint revealed what he described as a research and planning phase consistent with other premeditated murders. The progression of her search queries shows a methodical information-gathering approach, moving from general concepts to specific techniques relevant to her planned crime. Reed pointed to the timeline of Angela's library checkouts and internet searches as evidence of what he called a cognitive rehearsal period, where she mentally prepared for both the act itself and its aftermath. Particularly telling was her focus on researching cases where teenagers had successfully or unsuccessfully claimed self-defense after killing parents. She was essentially studying both the crime and the potential defense simultaneously. As the day's testimony continued, digital forensics expert Trevor Wong returned to the stand with a new piece of evidence that had been recovered from Angela's school email account. A draft email addressed to herself with the subject line, "Things to Remember." This draft, created on December 22nd, just 3 days before the murder, contains what appears to be notes about the snow globe display at the Airbnb. Wong testified, displaying the email on the courtroom screen. It includes the phrases glass case in study, key in desk drawer, and heaviest one with silver base, details that directly contradict the defendant's claim of spontaneously grabbing the snow globe during an argument, as she had clearly identified and located it in advance. The most emotionally charged moment of the day came when Carissa was recalled to the stand to identify items found in Angela's backpack, which had been seized during the initial investigation but only recently analyzed completely. These are printouts of the messages between James and Mara that Angela apparently found on his phone, Carissa confirmed, looking through the papers with visible pain. But these aren't complete. They're selective screenshots that only show portions of their conversations, the parts that could be misinterpreted without context. Side-by-side comparisons displayed for the jury showed how Angela had captured only fragments of exchanges that, when read in full, clearly indicated a familial rather than romantic relationship, evidence that suggested she had deliberately selected and preserved only the portions that supported her suspicions about an affair. As the seventh day of trial concluded, Prosecutor Anderson stood before the jury with the partially reconstructed snow globe in its evidence container. What you've heard today explains not just how this murder was committed, but why the physical evidence initially presented challenges for investigators. Anderson gestured toward Carissa, who sat with her head bowed in the gallery. A mother's misguided attempt to protect her daughter by hiding evidence and delaying her call to authorities nearly succeeded in obscuring crucial physical evidence. But forensic science, digital records, and ultimately Mrs. Connick's own testimony have revealed the truth behind this calculated, premeditated act of violence that took James Connick's life just 1 hour before he planned to introduce his daughter to the aunt she never knew. Throughout this devastating day of testimony, Angela maintained the same unnervingly calm demeanor she had displayed since her arrest, occasionally making notes on a legal pad, but showing no visible reaction to her mother's tearful account or the forensic evidence linking her conclusively to the crime. Legal observers noted that several jurors appeared visibly disturbed by Angela's lack of emotional response, particularly during her mother's testimony about finding her washing away evidence, a composed detachment that seemed increasingly to support the prosecution's portrayal of a calculated killer rather than a confused or frightened teenager who had made a tragic mistake. The testimony of Shannon Byers, Angela's school guidance counselor, created a hush in the courtroom that was different from previous days, a collective holding of breath as jurors and spectators alike recognized they were hearing evidence that could have potentially prevented James Connick's murder. Angela scheduled a meeting with me on December 2nd, ostensibly to discuss early college applications, Byers testified, referring to her meticulous counseling notes projected on the courtroom screen. But within minutes, the conversation shifted to what she called hypothetical scenarios involving family betrayal. Byers, a veteran counselor with 20 years of experience in the Aspen school system, appeared deeply troubled as she recounted Angela's questions during that initial session. Whether children were ever justified in extreme measures to protect one parent from another's betrayal, and what happened to minors who committed violent crimes in Colorado. "Did you document these concerning statements in your official records?" Prosecutor Anderson asked, highlighting the critical issue that would later become the foundation for Carissa Connick's civil lawsuit against the school district. "Yes, I noted them in my private counseling file for Angela," Byers confirmed, visibly uncomfortable as she glanced toward Carissa in the gallery. "I also consulted with our school psychologist about whether these statements constituted a reportable threat under mandatory reporting guidelines." The courtroom remained silent as Byers explained the tragic misinterpretation of confidentiality laws that followed. Our district's legal counsel advised that hypothetical scenarios discussed in counseling fell under student counselor confidentiality protections unless there was a specific, credible threat against an identified person, which at that time I didn't believe existed. Anderson gently but firmly pressed on this critical point. Ms. Byers, Angela met with you twice more before the Christmas holiday break, on December 9th and December 16th. Did these conversations include additional concerning content? Byers's voice trembled slightly as she responded. Yes, the discussions grew more specific with each meeting. On December 9th, Angela asked about cases where children had killed parents who were having affairs, presenting it as research for a psychology paper she was writing. The counselor's distress became more evident as she described the final meeting. On December 16th, Angela brought printouts of text messages she claimed proved her father was having an affair, and asked if someone her age would be justified in taking extreme measures if they had evidence a parent was destroying their family. The most damning testimony came when Byers revealed what Angela had said in the final moments of their last meeting. As she was leaving my office, she made a statement I've replayed in my mind countless times since learning about Mr. Connick's death. She said, "Sometimes people deserve what they get, and sometimes it takes someone with courage to deliver justice when the system won't." Byers's voice broke as she added, "I documented this statement and flagged it for follow-up after the holiday break, but I didn't recognize it as an imminent threat, a failure of judgment I will regret for the rest of my life." Following Byers's testimony, Anderson called Dr. Leon Goldstein, the Aspen School District's legal consultant, to explain the misinterpretation of confidentiality laws that had prevented intervention. The confusion stemmed from Colorado's specific mandatory reporting statutes as they apply to school counselors, Dr. Goldstein explained, referencing the legal guidelines displayed for the jury. While threats of harm to self or others must be reported, the statute requires clear and present danger, rather than hypothetical discussions. The tragic irony emerged as Goldstein acknowledged that Angela's statements, particularly in the final meeting, should have triggered mandatory reporting. In retrospect, once she presented what she believed was evidence of her father's affair and explicitly connected this to extreme measures, the hypothetical threshold was crossed. This should have been reported to both school administration and her parents immediately. Court documents related to Carissa Connick's civil lawsuit against the Aspen School District were then presented as evidence of the systemic failure that had contributed to the tragedy. Mrs. Connick filed this suit on January 15, 2025, alleging gross negligence in the district's application of confidentiality guidelines and failure to warn of a credible threat, Anderson explained, highlighting key sections of the legal filing. The lawsuit detailed how proper interpretation of mandatory reporting laws could have alerted Carissa and James to Angela's dangerous misinterpretation of the messages between James and his half-sister Mara, potentially preventing the Christmas morning murder through parental intervention. District Attorney Maxwell Jenkins then took over questioning to address the legal implications of the school's failure to report Angela's concerning statements. While this civil matter is proceeding separately from our criminal case, it establishes a critical timeline showing Angela's premeditation extending back at least 3 weeks before the murder. Jenkins displayed a timeline correlating Angela's counseling sessions with her library checkouts and internet searches, demonstrating how her conversations with Byers aligned perfectly with her escalating research into patricide cases and methods. What we see here is a methodical progression from ideation to planning to execution, with multiple points where intervention could have occurred had mandatory reporting laws been correctly applied. The testimony then shifted to the academic professionals who had evaluated Angela's schoolwork in the weeks leading up to Christmas break, with English teacher Martin Davies providing particularly revealing insights. Angela submitted a creative writing assignment on December 14th titled "Justice Served Cold," which in hindsight contained disturbing parallels to the actual murder she would commit 11 days later, Davies testified, visibly shaken as the essay was displayed on the courtroom screen. The story featured a teenage protagonist who discovered her father's betrayal and exacted justified vengeance using a family heirloom transformed into an instrument of justice. Details so closely mirroring the actual crime that several jurors exchanged troubled glances as Davies read excerpts aloud. At the time, I graded this as an A- paper, noting its vivid imagery and psychological depth, while suggesting Angela might want to explore more uplifting themes in future assignments, Davies admitted, his discomfort evident as he acknowledged the warning signs he had missed. I did note in my feedback that the protagonist's justification for violence seemed disproportionate to the father's offense. But I viewed this entirely as a creative exercise rather than a potential window into Angela's actual thoughts or plans. The English assignment, submitted just before Christmas break, represented yet another missed opportunity for intervention. A cry for help or warning sign that had been interpreted as merely creative expression rather than the violent ideation it represented. School Resource Officer Deputy Kevin Martinez testified about the larger context of missed warning signs throughout the fall semester leading up to the murder. Angela's behavior showed several red flags that, when viewed individually, didn't trigger formal intervention but collectively painted a concerning picture, Martinez explained, referencing the school's threat assessment protocols. She withdrew from previous friend groups, stopped participating in her usual extracurricular activities, and was observed spending lunch periods researching topics on her laptop rather than socializing. Most concerning was an incident in early December that hadn't been formally documented. A student reported overhearing Angela tell a classmate that some people deserve to be punished when discussing a news story about infidelity, a comment that was dismissed as teenage dramatization rather than reported up the chain. As the day's testimony continued, the court heard from Dr. Patricia Morgan, the clinical psychologist who had evaluated Angela's academic and counseling records as part of the investigation. What stands out in reviewing these materials is the systematic way Angela appears to have used the school environment to both research and rehearse aspects of her planned crime, Dr. Morgan testified, presenting her analysis of how Angela had effectively weaponized normal academic and counseling resources. Her psychology assignments focused on family dynamics and betrayal. Her creative writing explored justified violence. Her counseling sessions tested hypothetical scenarios, and her library research provided technical details, all while maintaining grades and attendance that wouldn't trigger additional scrutiny. Perhaps the most chilling testimony came from Angela's computer science teacher, who described a coding project Angela had submitted just before the holiday break. Students were assigned to create a decision tree algorithm, essentially a flowchart of if-then scenarios for a topic of their choice, explained Thomas Hill, displaying Angela's project on the courtroom screen. Angela created what she called a family crisis decision matrix that mapped out responses to parental betrayal, with branches leading to different outcomes based on evidence strength and intervention options. The final nodes of Angela's decision tree included options labeled Confront with Evidence, Public Exposure, and most disturbing of all, a path labeled simply Terminal Solution if certain conditions were met, a digital blueprint for the decision-making process that would ultimately lead to James Connick's murder. As the 8th day of testimony concluded, Prosecutor Anderson addressed the jury with a somber summary of the institutional failures that had contributed to the tragedy. What you've heard today represents a cascade of missed opportunities, moments when Angela Connick's increasingly explicit warning signs could have triggered intervention that might have saved James Connick's life. Anderson displayed a final timeline showing the parallel tracks of Angela's school activities and her preparation for murder. Each of these points represents a moment when proper application of mandatory reporting laws, threat assessment protocols, or simply greater attention to concerning behaviors might have changed the course of events that led to Christmas morning 2024. The jury filed out with solemn expressions, many glancing at Carissa Connick, whose civil suit now appeared not merely as a grieving mother seeking compensation, but as an effort to prevent similar tragedies through reform of school reporting practices. Throughout the day's testimony, legal observers noted that Angela's demeanor remained unchanged, the same eerily composed expression she had maintained since the trial began, occasionally making notes but showing no visible reaction to the evidence that her plans had been visible to many who failed to recognize them for what they were. Defense attorney Sutherland's cross-examination had attempted to frame these warning signs as normal teenage exploration of dark themes, rather than genuine preparation for violence, but the cumulative weight of evidence, the counseling sessions, the creative writing, the decision tree project, painted a picture of premeditation that was becoming increasingly difficult to dispute as the trial moved toward its final phase, and the testimony of psychological experts who would attempt to explain how a privileged 15-year-old honor student had methodically planned and executed the murder of her father on Christmas morning. Dr. Eliza Vernon, the forensic psychologist appointed by the court to evaluate Angela Connick, took the stand on the 9th day of trial, her credentials establishing her as a leading expert in adolescent criminal psychology with over 20 years of experience assessing juvenile offenders. I conducted 7 separate evaluation sessions with the defendant, totaling approximately 15 hours of direct clinical interaction, Dr. Vernon testified, her professional demeanor providing a stark contrast to the emotionally charged testimony of previous days. These sessions were supplemented by standardized psychological assessments, review of school records, interviews with teachers and family members, and analysis of the defendant's digital footprint, all standard protocol for a comprehensive forensic psychological evaluation of a juvenile facing serious charges. The courtroom fell silent as Dr. Vernon presented her findings, beginning with her clinical observations of Angela's affect and behavior during their sessions. What struck me immediately about Angela was her unusual emotional presentation, what we call affective flattening or reduced emotional expressivity, Dr. Vernon explained, referencing her detailed clinical notes. While most adolescents, even those who have committed violent acts, display some emotional distress, remorse, or at minimum anxiety about their situation, Angela maintained a consistently detached, analytical approach to discussing her father's murder, as if she were describing a hypothetical case study rather than an act she herself had committed. Prosecutor Anderson directed Dr. Vernon to explain the significance of this emotional detachment in the context of the crime. This effective presentation is particularly noteworthy because it remained consistent whether Angela was discussing mundane topics like her academic interests or directly addressing her father's murder. Dr. Vernon continued, her testimony delivered with measured precision. When specifically asked about her father's death and her role in it, she displayed what we call cognitive empathy, an intellectual understanding that others would expect her to feel remorse or grief, but showed no signs of emotional empathy, the actual experience of those emotions. The distinction proved crucial as Dr. Vernon explained how this pattern influenced her diagnostic conclusions. This combination of affective flattening with preserved cognitive empathy is often seen in cases involving significant planning rather than impulsive actions. The psychological assessment took a more technical turn as Dr. Vernon presented the results of standardized tests administered during her evaluation. Angela scored in the 93rd percentile for intelligence on the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, with particularly high marks in logical reasoning and verbal comprehension, she noted, displaying charts of Angela's cognitive profile. However, on measures of emotional intelligence and empathy, she scored significantly below average for her age group, particularly in the domains of emotional recognition and effective response. This cognitive profile, Dr. Vernon explained, created what she termed a dangerous combination of high intelligence with limited emotional processing, a pattern often seen in premeditated crimes involving calculated planning rather than emotional outbursts. Perhaps most revealing was Dr. Vernon's analysis of Angela's response to the thematic apperception test, a projective psychological assessment where subjects create narratives based on ambiguous images. When shown a picture of a family scene, Angela consistently interpreted neutral interactions as containing hidden hostility, betrayal, or deception, Dr. Vernon testified, displaying the innocuous family dinner image alongside Angela's dark interpretation. Her narrative focused on the father figure hiding secrets from the family, with the teenage daughter character described as the only one smart enough to see through his lies and responsible for protecting the mother who is too weak to see the truth. Themes that directly parallel the narrative she constructed around her own family situation. Dr. Vernon then addressed the central question of Angela's state of mind regarding her father's alleged affair. Based on my evaluation, Angela developed what we call a fixed false belief about her father's relationship with Mara, a conviction so firmly held that contrary evidence was either ignored or reinterpreted to support her existing narrative. This psychological pattern explained Angela's selective documentation of text messages between James and Mara, focusing only on fragments that could support her belief in an affair while disregarding content that clearly indicated a familial relationship. What makes this case distinct from typical adolescent misunderstandings is that Angela didn't merely hold this false belief. She methodically gathered what she considered evidence, researched historical cases similar to her situation, and planned a violent response with careful attention to both execution and aftermath. The court listened intently as Dr. Vernon explained the psychological phenomena that had transformed Angela from a high-achieving student to a calculated killer. We observed what I would describe as a perfect storm of adolescent cognitive development, pathological jealousy, and what's called righteous rage, a belief that one is justified in taking extreme action to right a perceived wrong. Dr. Vernon detailed how normal adolescent brain development, particularly the still maturing prefrontal cortex responsible for impulse control and consequence assessment, created vulnerability to fixed ideas and black and white thinking. However, most adolescents with similar cognitive limitations don't plan and execute murders. What distinguished Angela's case was the combination of this developmental vulnerability with her belief that she alone recognized a truth others couldn't see, and her conviction that violence was a justified response. Anderson directed the discussion toward the crucial question of Angela's capacity to understand the wrongfulness of her actions, a key consideration in cases involving juvenile offenders. Based on your evaluation, did Angela understand that killing her father was legally and morally wrong? Dr. Vernon's response was unequivocal. Yes, she had clear understanding of both the legal and moral prohibitions against killing. In fact, her extensive research into legal defenses for patricide demonstrates her awareness that such actions are normally criminalized. She wasn't operating under a delusion that murder was permissible, but rather under a conviction that her specific case represented a justified exception to these prohibitions. The most disturbing element of Dr. Vernon's testimony came when she described Angela's continued lack of remorse during their final evaluation session, conducted just 2 weeks before the trial began. When I asked Angela directly if she regretted her actions, knowing now that Mara was James's half-sister rather than a romantic partner, she displayed what we call cognitive maneuvering, shifting justifications rather than acknowledging error, Dr. Vernon recounted. She stated he still betrayed us by keeping Mara a secret, by putting her needs above our family's right to know, effectively recalibrating her justification rather than recognizing the fundamental mistake that led to her father's death. The psychological testimony took a surprising turn when Dr. Vernon addressed Angela's relationship with her mother, Carissa. During our sessions, Angela repeatedly expressed disappointment in her mother for what she termed weakness and failure to stand up for herself against James's perceived betrayal. This dynamic explained one of the most chilling aspects of the crime. Angela's statement to Detective Miller that she had killed James for her mother's sake, despite Carissa having no knowledge of Angela's suspicions. Angela cast herself in the role of protector and avenger, acting on what she believed her mother would want if she had the courage to admit it, a disturbing psychological projection that allowed Angela to justify murder as an act of family loyalty. Defense attorney Sutherland's cross-examination attempted to reframe Dr. Vernon's findings in terms of adolescent developmental limitations, emphasizing how teenage brain development affects decision-making and risk assessment. Would you agree, Dr. Vernon, that the adolescent brain is particularly susceptible to misinterpreting emotional situations and reacting with poor judgment? Dr. Vernon acknowledged the general principle while maintaining her specific conclusions about Angela. While adolescents as a group do show these vulnerabilities, most teenagers who misinterpret situations express their distress through much less extreme behaviors, like confrontation, emotional outbursts, or seeking adult intervention, rather than methodical research and planning of homicide. When court resumed after lunch, the prosecution called Dr. Raymond Hoffman, director of the Colorado Center for Juvenile Justice Psychology, to provide context for how Angela's case compared to typical patterns in adolescent violent crime. What makes this case statistically unusual is not just the gender of the perpetrator — female patricide is relatively rare — but the combination of premeditation with the specific weapon choice, Dr. Hoffman explained, referencing his database of juvenile homicide cases. Adolescent killings typically involve readily available weapons, household items, kitchen knives, occasionally family-owned firearms. The selection of an item from a locked display case represents an unusually deliberate weapon choice that required advanced planning rather than impulsive action. Dr. Hoffman's testimony included analysis of Angela's post-offense behavior, which he characterized as textbook evidence of premeditation rather than panic or remorse. The systematic attempt to clean fingerprints from the weapon, change clothes, and prepare a consistent narrative for police indicates someone who had mentally rehearsed not just the killing, but its aftermath, he noted, contrasting this with typical adolescent offenders who often break down, confess immediately, or attempt to flee after violent crimes. Most telling was Angela's immediate introduction of the affair motive to responding officers before being questioned, a behavior consistent with someone who had prepared a justification narrative in advance rather than responding spontaneously to police inquiries. As the psychological testimony concluded, Prosecutor Anderson invited Dr. Vernon to offer her professional opinion on the central question before the jury. Based on your extensive evaluation, would you characterize Angela Connick's actions on Christmas morning as a momentary lapse in judgment by a confused teenager, or as the culmination of a calculated plan developed over several weeks? Dr. Vernon's response was measured but definitive. The evidence overwhelmingly supports the conclusion that Angela's actions represented the execution of a premeditated plan, developed and refined over at least 3 weeks, with careful attention to both the act itself and the narrative she would present afterward to justify her actions. This conclusion directly supported the first-degree murder charge, which required proof of premeditation and deliberation rather than a spontaneous act of violence. The final witness of the day was Angela's former best friend, Sophia Martinez, who provided crucial testimony about changes in Angela's behavior in the weeks before Christmas. Around the beginning of December, Angela started acting different, more secretive, constantly checking her dad's phone when he left it unattended, making weird comments about how people can lead double lives and how sometimes families are built on lies, Sophia testified, visibly uncomfortable as she occasionally glanced at Angela, who maintained the same impassive expression she had shown throughout the trial. The last time we hung out, about a week before Christmas, she showed me screenshots of texts between her dad and someone named Mara, and kept saying she had proof he was betraying their family. When I suggested she might be misinterpreting things and should just ask him directly, she got really cold and said I didn't understand what needed to be done. This testimony from a peer provided additional confirmation of Angela's fixed belief and planning, particularly when Sophia described a disturbing conversation during their final interaction. Before I left that day, Angela asked me a question that seemed weird at the time, but now is just horrifying. She asked if I thought someone our age would go to regular prison or juvenile detention if they did something really serious to protect their family. Sophia's voice trembled as she concluded. I told her that was a crazy question and tried to joke about it, but she just stared at me with this intense expression and said, sometimes the only person strong enough to deliver justice is the one everyone underestimates. I was so creeped out that I made an excuse to leave early. That was the last time I spoke to her before what happened on Christmas. As the 9th day of trial concluded, the cumulative psychological profile presented by expert witnesses and Angela's peer painted a disturbing picture of a teenager who had methodically planned her father's murder based on a fundamental misinterpretation of his relationship with his half-sister. A misunderstanding that could have been clarified through simple communication, but instead had been nurtured into a justification for violence. Throughout this damning psychological testimony, Angela maintained the same unnervingly composed demeanor, occasionally making notes but showing no emotional response, even as her former best friend tearfully described their final interaction, reinforcing Dr. Vernon's clinical observations about her flattened affect and lack of emotional empathy that had been central to the psychological evaluation presented to the jury. The Aspen County Courthouse was filled beyond capacity on the morning of the sentencing hearing, with court officers turning away spectators after every seat in the gallery was taken. Judge Eleanor Harmon entered the courtroom with a solemn expression, the weight of the decision before her evident in her deliberate movements as she arranged her papers and prepared to hear the victim impact statements that would precede her final judgment. Angela Connick sat at the defense table wearing a simple navy dress, her posture as perfect and her expression as composed as it had been throughout the trial, appearing unnervingly calm for a 15-year-old about to learn whether she would spend most of her life in prison. Before the court pronounces sentence, we will hear victim impact statements from those most affected by James Connick's death, Judge Harmon announced, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. These statements allow the court to understand the full human impact of this crime beyond the legal proceedings we have concluded. The first to approach the podium was Robert Connick, James's older brother, who had flown in from Chicago for each day of the trial, sitting silently in the back row of the gallery as the details of his brother's murder were laid bare before the court and the media. My brother James was more than just the victim in this terrible case. He was a man who built his life around family, around bringing people together, Robert began, his voice steady, though his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edges of the podium. The supreme irony of his death is that it came just as he was trying to heal our family's old wounds by reuniting with Mara, bringing his half-sister back into the family fold after decades of separation. Robert spoke of James's devotion to his work, his community involvement in Chicago, and most pointedly, his love for his daughter Angela, describing how James had rearranged business trips to attend her school events and spent weekends helping with her science fair projects. The man I knew would be devastated not just by his own death, but by knowing his daughter will lose her freedom for decades because of a tragic misunderstanding that could have been resolved with a simple conversation. Mara Connick approached the podium next, her resemblance to James striking under the courtroom lights as she faced her niece for the first time since the trial began. "I never got to be your aunt, Angela," she said directly, breaking protocol to address the defendant rather than the judge, causing Angela to look up briefly from her notepad. "Your father spent months planning the perfect way to introduce us. He wanted it to be a joyful Christmas surprise, a gift of family connection he thought would mean so much to you." Mara's voice broke as she continued. "The text messages you found, the ones you thought proved he was betraying your family, were actually about him helping me escape an abusive relationship and planning how to safely integrate me into your lives without putting any of you at risk from my ex-husband." The most devastating revelation came when Mara held up a small gift box wrapped in silver paper. "This is what your father planned to give you on Christmas morning, just 1 hour after you took his life." With permission from the judge, Mara opened the package to reveal a delicate silver bracelet with 2 charms, a snowflake and a small letter A. He had one made for me, too, with an M charm. He called them our winter reunion bracelets, a symbol that our family was finally whole after being fractured for so long. Tears streamed down Mara's face as she concluded, "Instead of that moment of family healing, I spent Christmas morning identifying my brother's body and meeting my niece for the first time as she was led away in handcuffs, covered in her father's blood." A collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom as Carissa Connick rose from her seat in the front row, straightening her shoulders as she walked to the podium to deliver the statement everyone had been waiting for, the words of a woman who had lost her husband to violence committed by her own daughter. "Your Honor, I stand before this court as both a victim and a witness to the destruction of my family," Carissa began, her voice stronger than many expected after her emotional testimony during the trial. "On Christmas morning 2024, I lost my husband of 17 years to an act of violence I could never have imagined possible within our family. In the same moment, I effectively lost my daughter as well, not just to the justice system, but to the cold, calculating person she revealed herself to be." Carissa's statement took an unexpected turn as she addressed the broader implications of the case. "As this court is aware, I have filed a civil suit against Aspen School District for their failure to report Angela's concerning statements to her guidance counselor, a suit that continues despite today's sentencing." She paused, looking directly at Angela for the first time since the trial began. "But while the school bears responsibility for their failures, I must acknowledge that the person most responsible for James's death sits at that defense table, my daughter, who chose violence over conversation, murder over questions, and has shown no genuine remorse for taking her father's life based on a complete misinterpretation of his actions." The courtroom remained absolutely silent as Carissa continued, her words clearly causing discomfort for defense attorney Sutherland, who shifted in his seat as if considering an objection, but ultimately remained silent. "I have spent months trying to understand how the child I raised could meticulously plan her father's murder, execute it with such brutality, and then attempt to manipulate me into helping cover her tracks," Carissa said, her voice gaining strength rather than breaking as she confronted the painful reality. "The psychological evaluations presented during this trial have helped me understand the clinical aspects of Angela's thinking. But they cannot explain the fundamental choice she made to kill rather than communicate, to end her father's life rather than simply ask about the text messages she found." What followed was the moment that legal observers would later describe as the turning point in Angela's carefully maintained composure. "Angela, I want you to hear this directly from me," Carissa said, turning to face her daughter fully. "From this day forward, I am no longer your mother. The bond between us was severed not by this court or its sentence, but by your own hands when you chose to kill your father and showed no remorse afterward." Angela's expression changed for the first time since the trial began, a momentary widening of her eyes, a slight parting of her lips. As the impact of her mother's public disowning registered visibly on her face before she quickly reassembled her mask of indifference. The sentence this court imposes today cannot bring James back or heal the wounds you've inflicted on our family and community, Carissa concluded, addressing Judge Harmon once more. But it can ensure that Angela faces the full consequences of her actions and receives the intensive psychological intervention she clearly needs. I ask for the maximum sentence allowable, not out of vengeance, but out of recognition that the calculated nature of this crime and Angela's continued lack of remorse make her a danger that society must be protected from. As Carissa returned to her seat, several jurors who had remained for the sentencing hearing were visibly moved, with one older woman wiping tears from her eyes and another juror nodding in apparent agreement with Carissa's assessment. Following the victim impact statements, Prosecutor Claire Anderson rose to deliver the state's sentencing recommendation. Your Honor, the state of Colorado requests that this court impose the maximum sentence permissible for a juvenile defendant convicted of first-degree murder, life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after serving a minimum of 25 years. Anderson referenced the brutality of the crime, the extensive evidence of premeditation, and Angela's consistent lack of remorse as factors justifying the maximum sentence. While we acknowledge that Angela Connick's age prevents a sentence of life without parole under current Supreme Court precedent, the calculated nature of this crime and the defendant's continued justification of her actions demonstrate a need for the longest period of incarceration permissible to ensure both punishment and rehabilitation. Defense attorney Martin Sutherland presented a markedly different perspective in his sentencing argument. Your Honor, we ask the court to consider that regardless of the jury's verdict, Angela Connick remains a child, a 15-year-old with an immature brain who made a catastrophic error in judgment based on a fundamental misunderstanding of her father's actions. Sutherland emphasized adolescent brain development research, suggesting that teenagers lack fully developed capacity for risk assessment and impulse control. The minimum sentence of 15 years with possibility of parole would allow Angela to receive intensive psychological treatment while still providing a meaningful opportunity to demonstrate rehabilitation before spending her entire youth and early adulthood incarcerated. When asked if she wished to make a statement before sentencing, Angela rose slowly, her handcuffs clinking softly in the silent courtroom. I understand that everyone here believes I misinterpreted my father's relationship with Mara, she began, her voice clear and steady, lacking the emotional tremor one might expect from a teenager facing a life sentence. But even if she was his half-sister rather than his girlfriend, he still betrayed our family by keeping her existence secret for years, by prioritizing her needs over his obligation to be honest with us. This statement elicited audible gasps from the gallery, with Mara visibly flinching as Angela continued. I acted on the information I had at the time, and while the court has found me guilty, I maintain that I was protecting my family from a man who lived a double life and kept secrets that affected all of us. Judge Harmon's expression remained impassive as she listened to Angela's statement, though several legal observers noted a slight tightening around her eyes as the teenager concluded, without expressing remorse or acknowledging the gravity of taking her father's life. After Angela returned to her seat, Judge Harmon took several moments to review her notes before addressing the court with her sentencing decision. Angela Connick, you stand before this court having been convicted of murder in the first degree in the death of your father, James Connick, a crime made all the more tragic by the fact that it was based on a profound misunderstanding that could have been resolved through simple communication. The judge continued, her voice firm as she addressed both the legal and moral dimensions of the case. This court has carefully considered the evidence presented at trial, the jury's verdict, the victim impact statements, and the sentencing recommendations from both the prosecution and defense. I have also taken into account your age and the relevant Supreme Court rulings regarding juvenile sentencing, A hush fell over the courtroom as Judge Harmon prepared to announce her decision, with reporters poised to record the historic sentence in a case that had captured national attention. I find that the premeditated nature of this crime, the brutal method of execution, and your continued lack of remorse justify the maximum sentence permissible under Colorado law for a juvenile defendant convicted of first-degree murder. Judge Harmon's gavel struck with finality as she pronounced sentence. Angela Connick, I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after serving a minimum of 25 years in the Colorado Department of Corrections. The judge specified that Angela would remain in juvenile facilities until her 18th birthday, at which time she would be transferred to adult prison to serve the remainder of her sentence. Additionally, this court orders comprehensive psychological treatment throughout your incarceration, with particular focus on developing empathy, emotional regulation, and conflict resolution skills that may someday make you eligible for parole consideration. As the reality of spending the next 25 years in prison settled over the courtroom, Judge Harmon addressed Angela directly, one final time. Ms. Connick, you will be 40 years old before you become eligible for parole, older than your father was when you first suspected him of betraying your family. It is this court's sincere hope that those years will provide the maturity, insight, and perspective to understand the true tragedy of what occurred on Christmas morning 2024. Not just the loss of your father's life, but the destruction of your family based on a misunderstanding that could have been resolved with a simple conversation. The bailiffs moved forward to escort Angela from the courtroom as Judge Harmon concluded the proceedings. This case stands as a stark reminder of how easily assumptions can replace communication, how rapidly suspicion can override trust, and how devastating the consequences can be when we act on misunderstandings rather than seeking truth through honest dialogue. As Angela was led toward the side door that would take her back to juvenile detention, she turned briefly toward the gallery, her eyes meeting her mother's for a moment that observers described as electric. Carissa's expression remained resolute while something finally cracked in Angela's carefully maintained facade. A fleeting glimpse of emotion quickly suppressed as the teenager was led away to begin her 25-year sentence. Outside the courthouse, snow began falling gently over Aspen as reporters clustered around Carissa and Mara, who stood together supporting each other, two women united by loss and the painful process of rebuilding what remained of their family. We have no further comment beyond what was said in court, Carissa stated firmly, her arm linked with Mara's as they walked toward a waiting car. Behind them, the Aspen County Courthouse stood solid against the winter sky, justice having been served in one of the most disturbing cases in the mountain community's history, the Christmas snow globe murder that had shattered a family and revealed how easily misunderstanding, when nurtured by obsession and enabled by silence, could lead to irreversible tragedy. As Angela Connick began her first night of what would be more than 9,000 to follow before parole eligibility, the Austrian snow globe that had been both a murder weapon and the physical embodiment of her misinterpretation was cataloged into permanent evidence storage. Its once beautiful winter scene forever shattered, much like the family it had helped destroy, on what should have been a joyful Christmas morning in a snow-covered Aspen cabin, where a father had planned to introduce his daughter to the aunt she never knew existed, but instead met death at the hands of a child who chose murder over conversation, violence over understanding, in a tragic failure of communication that would echo through the Colorado legal system for years to come.